Here was National Security Council spokesman John Kirby today.
Here's the bottom line. The most effective response to Russia's horrific violence against the Ukrainian people is to continue to provide Ukraine with vital air defense capabilities and other types of military equipment. Ukrainians deserve to know that the American people and this government will continue to stand with them. So it's critical that Congress meets this moment and responds by providing Ukraine with what they need to defend themselves. The time for Congress to act is now.
The time for Congress to act is now. But as the White House continues to hammer that message, congressional Republicans, once staunch allies of democracy and opponents of authoritarianism, have remained defiant. Yesterday, the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, held a press conference at the U.S. southern border where he said that Republicans will not pass any Ukraine aid package unless President Biden agrees to draconian new border restrictions. For weeks now, the Biden administration has signaled a willingness to compromise with Republicans on border policies in order to get aid for Ukraine, so much so that some Democrats have raised concerns about how much Joe Biden is willing to trade away. But Republicans have rejected those compromises because for them, rejecting aid to Ukraine while hammering Biden on the border is itself a victory for their MAGA base. When asked about the prospects of a deal, the Republican Congressman Troy Nehls told CNN yesterday, quote, "I'm not willing to do too damn much right now to help a Democrat and to help Joe Biden's approval rating." Let's just understand that for a moment. Republicans are willing to let Ukraine, a democratic country and a U.S. ally, fall in order to keep Joe Biden or a Democrat from winning this next election, which is music to the dictators and authoritarians of the world. Authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin do not have to worry about re-election campaigns. Putin is in one right now, but his main opponent is in jail. He will remain in power for as long as he wants, which means he and Xi Jinping and Ayatollah Khamenei and Kim Jong-un can just wait it out until Joe Biden is out of office and the world's democracies are no longer united, or until the United States is once again led by a president who talks about leaving NATO, who admires authoritarian leaders, who does not care about protecting democracies like Ukraine. A president who famously withheld military aid for Ukraine until it agreed to dig up dirt on his domestic political rival. A second Trump presidency that would be a threat to democracy here at home, but also around the world. Joining me now is the retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel and former Director of European Affairs at the National Security Council, Alexander Vindman. Also with us tonight, Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama and the co-host of Pod Save the World. Gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Colonel Vindman, when you and I started talking...
Before they go much further on this, I'm going to weigh in. You've heard me use the scenario before. I'm just going to bring up the Civil War real quick about the South versus the North versus the South. That the South actually felt as if the North had pulled a biscuit out of its mouth, to the degree that there was a lot of Southerners down here that was admiring what was going on in the North pertaining to slavery and pertaining to profiteering off of slavery. And then all of a sudden, Lincoln decides to basically go to war with his own country in telling the Southerners that they wasn't allowed to do that. And of course, by him doing that, to have keep the nation united, he had to oppose slavery for both sides, and there was 2 states in the North that had already legalized slavery on a state level. So to me, this is the same thing of pulling the biscuit out of somebody's mouth whenever you make a commitment to a country pertaining to the Ukrainians, and now all of a sudden you're crawfishing backwards in your obligations and your responsibilities towards one of your allies. Now, Marvin Alexander can say whatever he wants to say, and the same way with Donald J. Trump. But the bottom line is this: whenever you sit there and watch a David and Goliath perform right in front of your very eyes, and you're not willing to help the little David. Why the Goliath takes advantage of the little David after you have already told little David, then I'm going to be there with you. We're going to protect you and we're going to be there for you. Whenever it gets to the point that the American people can no longer be self-sustainable in our politicians that make obligations and then crawfish away from them, then we as a nation are in big, big trouble. As I said, it's like using the scenario that in which what I've used before. It's like telling somebody, okay, this is yours. You put the biscuit in their mouth, and then a half hour later you decide, oh, no, I got to pull that out. And you jerk the biscuit out of their mouth. It's like, what are you doing? Talk about a letdown. The Southern people was let down because the North was profiteering off of slavery. There was a few slave owners down in the South, but not near as many as up in the North. And that's the part that our history does not truly document accurately, that basically puts out a false narrative, because the North had slavery going on probably, I'm going to estimate, give or take about 30 to 50 years before the South ever thought about it, because the Southern people was more of a poor type people. You keep in mind, if you go up the ladder, even into the 1929, 1932 Depression, a lot of the people in the South did not feel that. And the reason why they didn't feel that was because they was already so poor. They was already doing without so much already, that whenever the stock market crashed, what difference did it make? They was already poor to begin with. I hope that you get my analogy towards what I'm trying to say here. Let's listen to some more of this, because this is very, very crucial. Not necessarily so much crucial in my life because of my age, but it's crucial to our children and our children's children and their children, pertaining to America's future. And if we don't have enough sense to identify that, then you know what? Maybe we are like the Afghanistan people. Maybe we do deserve to be under some sort of a authoritarian rule, because democracy was never free to begin with. It costed sweat, blood, and tears with the original design of an ideal or a dream that fairness and equal justice was for all and not just part of all or partial towards all. And whenever you get to looking at your territorial oligarchs all over the world, their justice basically supports their needs, their wants, not the people's. And whenever you start teeter-tottering back and forth on that, then you're reaching an area, historically speaking, that once you dive off into, you may not never be able to regain that ground back over again. Please listen.
Talking about Ukraine years ago, after you so bravely reported on that phone call in which Donald Trump tried to shake down the then new president of Ukraine. It was about our allies. It was about European safety. It was about curtailing and expansionist Russia. But it wasn't then centrally about democracy, the state of democracy in the world. Today it kind of is. We have learned that democracy around the world is fragile, and that Ukraine to some degree is our front line for this.
That's very true. First, let me start by saying Happy New Year.
And to you,
start on a positive note. It's amazing being on with you, because you get to the heart of the matter. The other cable news network is running the audition for the vice president for Donald Trump, who's looking to destroy our democracy, and you're focused on the real threats to democracy and the fact that we have a election about democracy and freedoms. And this is a threat that we're talking about domestically, but around the world, we see a proliferation of threats, not just from Russia and Ukraine, where we started the conversation nearly 2 years ago, but these threats have abounded. We have instability in the Middle East, coordinated by a ally of Russia, Iran, that's running proxies that are attacking U.S. interests and commercial interests. We have threats in the Pacific. We have the North Koreans providing long-range missiles to Russia. This is a much, much more complex year than we started 2 years ago, frankly, or the past year. And I fear that we might be alert to the dangers at home. That seems to be the pattern in the election in 2020 and 2022, likely to play out in 2024. But we are not sufficiently focused on threats abroad. We're not sufficiently focused on the fact that Russia keeps marching forward. Its relationships with other authoritarian regimes get tighter, and we are in for a very, very difficult year at home and abroad.
And Ben, what Colonel Vindman just said, I think is interesting. The threats have proliferated. The world is just fundamentally a more dangerous place than it was 4 years ago. And what happens, or what we do, not just what happens in Ukraine, what America does, how America leads in Ukraine, is something that not just our allies are worrying about and paying attention to, but more importantly, perhaps our adversaries.
Yeah, I think that, look, we're living through a phase of an authoritarian renaissance of sorts of the ethno-nationalist variety, Ali, and it's been going on for several years. And one thing Americans have to understand is it's not just a foreign policy issue. It's the fact that this trend is interconnected. You don't get this many nationalist authoritarian leaders in this many different places absent there being some interconnectivity. You've got Vladimir Putin in Russia. You've got Xi Jinping in China. You've got Narendra Modi in India. You've got Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. You've had Bolsonaro in Brazil. You've had Duterte in the Philippines. These are very different places, and I could unfortunately list 5 or 10 more countries at least.
Absolutely.
The reality is that there's a pushback against democracy, and Ukraine is the most acute manifestation of that, where you have the leader, the kind of vanguard of this autocratic trend in Vladimir Putin, literally trying to extinguish a sovereign democracy that is a part of Europe. That is both about the expansionist agenda of Russia that could lead to threaten other countries, including NATO countries in Eastern Europe. But it's also about Putin wanting to send a message about which way the world is going. Is the world going in the direction of people like Vladimir Putin, a world without law, a world without rules, a world in which might makes right alone? Or is the world going to stand up for some principle other than might makes right? That's what Ukraine is really about. And this is about our domestic politics as much as anything else. Because if we are one of the dominoes that falls and Donald Trump returns to power, not only is Ukraine finished, essentially, they're going to be cut off of any U.S. assistance. Not only is Eastern Europe going to be potentially threatened by Russian expansionism, but there are plenty of nationalists waiting in the wings in other democracies in parts of Europe who might be poised to seize that momentum and get elected themselves. And we could be looking at a very different and more dangerous world even than today in a few years.
And that's not metaphorically speaking, that's literally speaking. He's talking about basically science where the rubber meets the road in facts. And of course you can see that with a culture of people, the younger ones that stand up for Hamas versus standing up for Israel. Jerusalem, I mean, it's the proof is there. If you can't identify that there's more people that are wicked and evil today versus those that stand up for the righteousness of the Heavenly Father through the Son of Jesus, if you can't see that all over the world, that's now basically blooming. And it's just a matter of time before it's going to get into full bloom if we, as a sovereign Christian nation, first of all, can't recognize it, and second of all, can't act in response to it. This is where the Christians, the so-called Christians, needs to take their finger and point at themselves by saying, you know what, this is our fault. We have allowed for this to get in the shape that it's in. So whenever people like President Putin over in Russia, pertaining to his illegitimate government, stands on the podium and says, we got cheated. We got cheated. In essence, what he's saying is, because the Christian world in the Western world did not stand up in its promotions of biblical Bible prophecy, now you're going in the opposite direction. Instead of going in the direction towards peace and utopia, now you're going in the direction toward total chaos, anarchy, possibly a major third world war that could lead into thermonuclear war. Now, if that is not a scary thought for our independent security here in America, then there's never going to be a red flag that's going to be raised in response towards all this until it actually occurs. And of course, after it actually occurs, then it's going to be too late to regain that leadership stability again all over the world towards being the free nation, the free country of the world, or the mouthpiece of the rest of the free countries of the world. To regain that back is like next to impossible. That would be like telling Walmart over here in America that you're going to have to shut down all your retail stores, all your grocery stores. You're going to have to just shut down, period, because now we're going to go back like we used to be towards bringing in mama papa businesses that's going to be selling hardware, and they're going to be selling makeup, and they're going to be selling groceries, and they're going to be selling sports, and they're going to be selling clothing, they're going to be selling all this other stuff. The odds of that happening is like a million zillion trillion to one. In other words, it ain't going to happen. It'd be like telling all these big farmers around here, instead of them farming, some of them anywhere from 175 to 500 acres apiece, you still got some farmers, very few, less than a quarter of a half of a percent, that's farmed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000, 1,200 acres. But most all the other ones are farming like 3 times that, because they got the equipment that can move over the ground now, that can go in and basically just run over acres and acres and acres in just a matter of hours that it used to take days. You think everybody's going to go and submerge and give up all their equipment and basically bankrupt themselves to the point that all now mama papa farmers can come back in business so they can farm 6, 3, 4, 5, 800, 1,000 acres apiece? You think that's going to happen? I kind of doubt it. Instead of us downsizing, we have a tendency over here in America to build barns and build them even bigger. It's the same thing with democracy and autocracy. It's the same thing. Whenever you have a world that's now leaning towards paranormal antichrist scenarios or syndromes versus a world that's standing up for holiness and righteousness, then you got an upside down world. Then you should have red flags popping up everywhere and understanding, hey, wow, this is fixing to happen, not necessarily to us, but it's going to happen to our children and our grandchildren and their children's children. And we have brought this upon to the world, or brought this upon to our loved ones, because we did not do the proper commitment Christianity things.
Colonel Vindman, I remember in the early days of the war, there was speculation by a lot of intelligence agencies around the world, including our own, that Russia could take Ukraine very quickly. They offered Vindman the ability to leave the country. He declined. They offered, I'm sorry, Vindman. I'm talking about Volodymyr Zelensky. You're a pretty brave guy too, though. They offered him the ability to go to the western part of Ukraine. He declined. He stayed in Kyiv. He posted videos every night. He gives a message every night. He motivates his people and tells them that they can win the war. And yet, around the world, and the Ukrainian people see this, he's got his officials, he's got himself going to America begging, saying, we could lose this war if you don't continue to fund us. How dangerous is this? Could Ukraine lose this war?
It's unlikely that Ukraine could lose in the next year or two. I think absent this funding, this supplemental funding for Ukraine, things get considerably more complex. There are still options on the table. The U.S. can move in the direction of asset forfeiture and transfer of these $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. That's one of the solutions. But it really does get complex because it looks like we're just not serious. We're not serious about our security. We're not serious about our allies. And the fact is that invites attacks. That invites Russia to conduct this war in the first place. I think on the heels of a January 6th insurrection, on the heels of a hyper-partisanship driven by MAGA, it invites the Iranians to advance their interest in the Middle East, including propelling their proxy networks to attack U.S. and world interests. And, we're talking about world commerce. It propels the Chinese to recalculate the cost-benefit analysis on conducting a war to seize Taiwan and bring it back into the fold. There are the Venezuelans in Latin America with their aspirations to seize Guyanan oil, DPRK and its agenda to extort resources and maintain power. These are all opportunists. These are opportunists that smell blood in the water and see an opportunity to really go after democracies that are waffling and seem disinterested in investing in their security. And this is the one area that, it really does concern me. I think we may possibly have turned the corner. At least there are some indications that the population in the U.S. is voting on democracy. It is not a typical pattern, but we are not serious about our security. There are fundamental decisions that need to be made about Ukraine supplemental aid. And the administration could take steps on its own right to really significantly improve the support to Ukraine. That's intelligence sharing, that's logistical support. These are not expensive, big ticket items. These are small policy changes that the administration could take on its own and just has refused to do that. And I really urge the administration to see the dangers of Ukraine maybe flagging, losing territory and inspiring other authoritarian regimes to advance.
This articulation that Colonel Vindman had, Ben, about it just looks like we're not serious. This is obviously, when you were at the National Security Council, this is a very, very important issue, right? The idea is when Donald Trump weakened NATO, it's not that he actually did anything. He sort of said, we're not that serious about this. You guys need to do this. We may not be around. It's these implications that we're not going to be solid partners to you. You and I have talked to world leaders who are very, very concerned about this. They do think that if they have to make a determination that the United States is not serious, they start strategizing about their worldview differently.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's right. And let me try to be very specific about this, Ali, because this began to get worse in the Obama years, where it used to be that there were some baseline issues of national security, where bitter political opponents, like John McCain and Barack Obama, who might even have disagreements about foreign policy, they would agree on the building blocks of what American national security was. NATO, Article 5 commitments, the collective defense of NATO, the need to stand up for certain values around the world.
The cornerstones.
And that was a continuum since World War II and through the Cold War. You started to see a trend where Republicans would politicize every aspect of national security. If Barack Obama was for one thing one day, they'd be against it. If he switched his position somehow, then they'd switch their position. And that's obviously gotten worse ever since then.
And what does the Bible say? It says a divided house cannot stand. And you can look at the planet towards it being basically a house based upon Christianity, democracy, And as this is deteriorating, eroding, here comes the who? Here comes the boogeyman. See, that was the thing that our ancestors was faced upon back in World War II. That if they did not create the atom bomb to go up against a madman over there in Hitler, it is a very strong possibility that right now we could be speaking German. And instead of us having courts to where we vote in our politicians and vote out our politicians, it would basically be a communist controlled country over here. That's how close that our ancestors come of losing their democracy. Their democracy is our democracy. Now you can see the boogeyman sneaking back out in different areas again, but this time, guess what? He's got advanced military hardware. He's got the atom bomb and the nuclear bomb too. So whenever the individual said what he said a while ago, that he didn't look for Russia to be able to conquer or defeat the Ukrainians in a year or 2 years, if Russia wanted to, if they wanted to put themselves way out there on the limb, they could end the war within the next 24 hours by sending about, I'm going to say 10 or 12 nuclear bombs, would basically end the war. But now, it would end the war with the Ukrainians. Would it actually end the war with their democracy? Would their democracy stand up and not tolerate that and be a major retaliation coming from the Europeans over there? Or would they sit back and just allow for it to happen without any consequences? This thing is teeter-tottering right now, back and forth, back and forth. And whenever you're dealing with people that are basically out of their minds, they're out of their minds. You're no longer dealing with a logical group of people. Just like Hitler was not a logical person. Just like Hamas and the group over there are not logical people by saying that they want to desecrate Jerusalem. Just like Iran and those places over there that are now saying death to America, death to America. If the American people are not sitting back and taking these things serious, it's going to fall just like the scenario happened with the Afghanistan women and children that now are let down because of their own adults that didn't take the Taliban serious, that within 11 days took back over their country. Took back over their country, and now, guess what? They're slaves to the Taliban. They're slaves to an oligarch society over there that basically are at their beck and call. If that's what the American people don't watch, that's what's going to happen. And it's not just going to happen to America, but it's going to happen to all the other free democracy nations all over the world. And that's sad. That is really, really sad, because you know what? The football's in our court. It's in our court, and it's up to us towards how we respond and how we react to the enemy that is out to kill, steal, and destroy. And if we don't take these things serious, and I brought this up on other videos before, Jesus not one time was enlightened or took his enemy in a light type form. He always addressed the devil, Lucifer, the Antichrist, in a very, very serious manner, all the way to his very death, because he knew from his death, from the time he started his ministry, what he was going up against. That's what I think that the American people have lost their better edge towards. They don't realize what they're actually going up against. And they have allowed now for not just the wolf to be protecting the chickens at the chicken coop, but now they've allowed for the wolf to actually come into their existences here in America, pertaining to compromising on righteousness, pertaining to the church world. I ain't going to try to brag about this because I don't deserve any type of recognition. All my recognition goes to God. But I truly believe that if I wasn't as stern as I was towards social media pertaining to the internet and YouTube and Facebook and all these other things, I really don't know for sure that it would have ever come out to the forefront. And you probably heard me say, well, if I can see these dangers that's going to affect thousands and millions of people's lives over here pertaining to having divorces and murders and now we're having gang robberies whenever 50 or 60 or 100 people get together on the internet, and the next thing you know, they attack a business, and the business people basically can't do nothing about it other than stand there and watch them. My friends, we're in trouble. And if you can't see this, then probably you're actually part of the problem versus part of the solution to it. We have been sliding backwards ever since the late 80s. That has led us where we are today, that I continue to keep telling various people that was part of this movement that you're going to be held accountable for at Kenton, Tennessee. And whenever I say Kenton, Tennessee, I'm not talking about every individual in Kenton, Tennessee. I'm talking about certain people in Kenton, Tennessee. Whenever I point out Martin, Tennessee, I'm not talking about everybody in Martin, Tennessee. Whenever I talk about Weakley County or Cydonia or Hopin or Union City or whatever, I'm not talking about everybody. You got to be logical in what I'm trying to say here. I'm talking about various individuals that started something by not supporting something correctly, that now look at where it has led and look at where it is leading. Once more, you don't approach your enemy in the status of if he does it. You approach your enemy when he does it. Just like all the school shootings, it hadn't been until just recently whenever they decided to implement basically lawmen in their schools. That was now mandatory in most states. Whenever we was growing up, we didn't have police officers. You see how things have changed? And once they ever change, the odds of them going back like they used to be is slim to none. Since 9/11, now we got U.S. Flight marshals, FBI agents, tactical SWAT, and everything else that hangs around all these airports that we didn't have before 9/11. You think all that's going to go away? I kind of doubt it. That's here to stay. So that is an entity that's going to be taxed off of our taxes because we dropped the ball. It's kind of like the old saying, one bad apple spoils a whole bunch, and now everybody has to pay for the one bad apple. That's what they're saying here. You need to pay very close attention to what these people are talking about if you care about your loved ones, your children, or your children's children's future pertaining to their freedom.
Donald Trump's election, when he came in and he tore up a whole bunch of agreements that Obama had reached, and he basically upended American policy when it came to even at first hesitating to articulate the common defense of NATO. The message that sent was America is not reliable. The dysfunction and toxicity in its democracy has rendered it an unreliable superpower and ally. And the thing that Joe Biden can't fix himself is that continues to this day. Even allies who welcome Joe Biden, welcome the leadership of the United States and rallying NATO around Ukraine, they're sitting back and wondering, well, is Donald Trump going to come back? Vladimir Putin is sitting there thinking, I just have to wait this guy out. maybe I have to interfere in the 2024 election to try to get Donald Trump elected. My strategy is a waiting game. I, as a dictator, have more staying power than American democracy because they're swinging back and forth like a crazy pendulum, and they're not reliable. And that's what this is really about. If we cannot sustain a policy, if we cannot sustain something like the basic support for Ukraine, a democratic country that is under assault, if we can sustain that for more than a couple of years because Congress can't get its act together, how is any nation in the world going to trust our word? How are allies going to trust our collective defense agreements? If they cannot do that, they are going to start to hedge. They are going to start to bend to the pressure from a China or Russia because the United States can no longer be relied on as the cornerstone of their security. We are already dealing with that just because of Donald Trump's previous administration. If he gets back into the White House, that's gone for a generation at least, if it's something we can ever get back. That is how high the stakes are in this election.
If we can ever get it
It's
back.
important that we realize that as we are struggling for democracy in our own country, that we have a massive role to play in the rest of the world. Guys, thanks very much. We appreciate that. Retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and the former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, Ben Rhodes. We appreciate your time tonight. We got lots more news to get to tonight, including the ouster of Harvard's former president, Claudine Gay, a major notch on the belt for conservative activism, but also an assault on the public's faith in institutions. But first, Republican presidential candidates are making their final push ahead of the Iowa caucuses in just 11 days. We'll look at what's cutting through to voters and what's not. That's next. Stay with us.
A divided house will not stand. You can look at the planet Earth towards it being a house. And as these democracies are being hit, gouged, pushed around, and they're not being stern, you're looking at something that's in the making that once it happens, it may not never go back to being like it used to be.
Race.
Danger, danger, danger. So many red flags.
Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence and these other sort of pre-Trump candidates, we want to live in the, make America great again, America first policies. That's the Republican Party that people want. And so, look, I think that there can be a world in which Nikki Haley outperforms expectations in Iowa, comes in second over DeSantis, more or less ending or at least putting in a deep freeze his political career, goes into New Hampshire with some wind at her back, which is the only state that is sort of really tailor-made to be a not terribly Trumpy state, and does well there. But then I think she hits a wall in her own home state of South Carolina, where Trump is favored by a lot. I mean, and you look at the Super Tuesday states, the amount of narrative shifting that you would have to do. You would have to say that Nikki Haley, she would have to beat Trump in New Hampshire outright to even start to shift that perception a little bit, and I view that as highly unlikely.
Yeah, the numbers are big here. When you think of some of the come from behind victories in the past, even in singular races, they've generally never been this kind of spread. Sarah, thanks for amazing work. We really appreciate it. Sarah Longwell is the publisher of Bulwark. All right, still ahead tonight as Donald Trump tries to evade accountability for allegedly interfering in the 2020 election. His lawyers are the judge overseeing his D.C. case, or asking the judge overseeing his D.C. case to hold the prosecutors accountable. But first, while the right celebrates the removal of Harvard's president, there are some on the left who argue that Claudine Gay's ouster is just one part of a broader political war, and there's someone on the right who agrees. We'll tell you who next. to press on for change. That was 3 months ago. And in the months since, the institution's courage was tested. The conservative activist Chris Rufo led a coalition of mostly right-wing opponents in a plan to remove Gay as Harvard's president, using allegations of plagiarism and anti-Semitism. Since Gay resigned earlier this week, the conservative coalition has been downright gleeful. Chris Rufo even tried to tweet that he scalped Harvard's president. Of course, he had to learn how to spell the word scalped first. But here on this program, let's have the courage to ask why. Why was toppling Claudine Gay so important to Chris Rufo's project? In an op-ed yesterday, Claudine Gay offered an answer. Quote, "This was merely a single skirmish in a broader war to unravel public faith in pillars of American society. Campaigns of this kind often start with attacks on education and expertise because these are the tools that best equip communities to see through propaganda. But such campaigns don't end there. Trusted institutions of all types, from public health agencies to news organizations, will continue to fall victim to coordinated attempts to undermine their legitimacy and ruin their leaders' credibility," end quote. And according to Rufo, she's right. This campaign against Claudine Gay was about toppling institutions and reshaping them in a conservative mold. He said so himself in his own Wall Street Journal op-ed this week titled, "How We Squeezed Harvard to Push Claudine Gay Out." Quote, "If America is to reform its academic institutions, the symbolic fight over Harvard's presidency must evolve into a deeper institutional fight, a grueling form of trench warfare in which each concept, structure, and institution must be challenged to change the culture." He continues, "If there's any hope of stopping America's cultural revolution, it must begin with a clear-eyed understanding of how to wield power and reshape institutions in the real world," end quote. In an interview with Politico, he called it really a textbook example of successful conservative activism. Conservative activism to topple the institutions responsible for maintaining our democracy and making it more inclusive. Educational institutions that helm information and analysis. Journalistic institutions that separate truth from misinformation. Even public health institutions that help keep us alive. We've already begun to see what happens when conservative activism tarnishes the integrity of public health institutions in places like Florida. I'll have more on that story next.
We have a new home. What's next?
Starting to erode, just like a cancer.
Kept dying a lot. The excess.
Fauci on COVID.
We bucked Fauci.
We beat Fauci on COVID.
That was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis literally running for president on the idea that defying our nation's public health experts is a good thing. As governor, DeSantis did things like mocking students for wearing masks, banning local governments from implementing their own COVID mitigation, and most importantly, DeSantis lobbied against vaccine mandates and eventually against the vaccine itself. Researchers at Yale looked at COVID death rates in Florida and Ohio before and after the COVID vaccine was made available. They found that while the death rates were pretty comparable before a vaccine became available, after the vaccine became available, Democrats stopped dying as much, while Republicans kept dying a lot. The excess death rate for Republicans was 43% higher than that of Democrats. And now, as we're in yet another COVID surge, still, here's Ron DeSantis, handpicked surgeon Joe Ladapo, talking about vaccines yesterday.
Frankly, I think it probably does have some integration at some levels with the human genome, because these vaccines are honestly, they're the antichrist of all products.
The antichrist of all products. Yesterday, Surgeon General Ladapo called for a full halt in the use of all mRNA COVID vaccines. He cited the very debunked allegation that they can somehow alter your DNA. Joining us to help us understand why that doesn't make any sense at all is Dr. Peter Hotez.
Now, do you see all the mixed signals. Now let's go back to the bedrock of what the Bible says about mixed signals. It says that Satan is the author of confusion. Now, what's motivating all this, and what's the end game to all this? That's where your red flag should be going up right now on all Democrat fronts, on all Democrat countries, in understanding that there is a siege, a spiritual siege, that if we don't watch, we will lose our footing. And once we ever lose our footing, it is a possibility that we will never gain it back. And these oligarchs are these communist people that are doing what they're doing right now. They're seeing this as an opportunity. In other words, you strike the iron while the iron's hot, and because the iron keeps getting hotter and hotter, it's more of a grab for them, regardless whether it's Russia or China or whoever, that it's a wildfire out of control.
Tez, professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and microbiology.
Now, they told you the facts before that guy said what he said about the vaccine being basically an antichrist to all the other vaccinations out there. They showed you the facts between the Democrats and the Republicans towards the death rate, using two different states before and after. Now let's listen to what he's got to say.
At Baylor College of Medicine, the author of the new book, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, A Scientist's Warning. This is a man who I've talked to literally from the days before COVID was spreading. Peter, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. Can you just help us understand what the Florida Surgeon General is warning about mRNA vaccines and DNA?
Yeah, and it's, but the bottom line is it's misinformation. And as you rightly point out, it's that kind of misinformation that caused so many Americans to refuse COVID vaccines in our red states, including my state of Texas, with, as my book points out, 200,000 needless deaths because people refuse COVID vaccines because they believe the misinformation. And so what he's talking about is the fact that many vaccines, because they're biologics, do have residual amounts of fragments of DNA, not oncogenes, not genes that cause cancer, but fragments of DNA. And they're generally in the picogram to nanogram range. For those of you who don't use the metric system a lot, that's 1/1,000,000th of a gram. And these are kind of random fragments, but getting that into actually cells and into the nucleus is a tough job. That's why we have no DNA vaccines, Ali, because DNA fragments have to traverse two membranes, the outer membrane of the cell and the nuclear membrane, and that's why we have to use special electroporation devices to get a DNA vaccine in. And so the amount of any picogram, 1/1,000,000th of a gram fragments of DNA that can get into the nucleus is very, very tiny, if at all. And then we have special innate immune system proteins that prevent it from integrating. So even if that happens, 99% or more is not going to integrate into the DNA. The bottom line is this is just a scare tactic to scare people away from taking mRNA vaccines. They're extremely safe. There's no evidence of DNA integration. And it's important now more than ever, just about to save your life or to stay out of the hospital. Why? Because this new JN1 variant that's now rising across the nation, and now we're back up to 30,000 hospitalizations again. You need this new annual immunization, which is specifically tailored for the XBB-like variants that are circulating. And if you don't take it, now you're at risk of hospitalization again. So why he would send out this message at all, and why he'd send out this message at this time when we're desperate to convince Americans, only about 19% of Americans have even taken this new annual immunization, makes no sense at all, and certainly is not fitting with someone who's supposed to be a public health leader.
Basically asking people to take a risk on risking their lives, which is gross negligence from the professional world, which is another red flag of the Antichrist spirit, the actual Antichrist spirit that's out to kill, steal, and destroy, that's the author of confusion. If people can't see through this, you are in danger, just like the democracy part pertaining to autocracy versus democracy. If you cannot see this and identify this, then odds are you're probably part of the problem versus part of the solution to it.
At least we have folks like you, Peter, who for a long time have been giving us the science and not treating us like idiots. I'm hoping that we will research it and we will listen. So thank you for the work that you continue to do, my friend. I appreciate it. Peter Hotez is a professor. He's a vaccine developer. He's been talking about this for a long time before any of us knew what COVID-19 was. He's the author of the new book, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, A Scientist's Warning. All right, we're going to be right back.
Wow, that was an unbelievable interview right there.
Today cast that motion in a sinister light, calling it part of, quote, the prosecutor's desperate effort to harass President Trump and prevent his likely victory in the 2024 presidential election, end quote. They're asking Judge Chutkan to order Jack Smith to explain why he should not be held in contempt of court, as well as to withdraw all of their filings since the case was stayed and be forced to give Trump money to pay for his legal bills. Joining me now to understand this is Joyce Vance, former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. Joyce, I want you to help me with this one. This one I'm troubled by. I don't understand it. Judge Chutkan stayed the case because it had been appealed to higher courts, and I guess that's what she had to do. So now they're saying that because it was stayed, he's manipulating stuff. Is that what's going on here?
Right. So Trump's team is saying that Jack Smith violated the rules that the game is supposed to be played by. This isn't a motion that will have any impact on Trump's ultimate guilt or the failure to convict him. This isn't about that. This is just about whether the court is divested of jurisdiction to do anything else while the immunity appeal is ongoing. And frankly, there's a good argument that the judge does lack that jurisdiction and that Smith should not have filed these motions while that appeal was ongoing.
Okay, so what happens then? Let's say the judge agrees with him. Does he just sort of put it on hold and bring it up when the trial's back in motion?
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think that this rises to the level of contempt. Trump's lawyers have asked the judge to issue what's called a show cause notice, and it would ask Smith to defend himself against the charges of contempt. Here, the judge might simply say, look, these motions can sit on the record and the Trump camp has no obligation to respond. Or she might even ask the clerk to take these off of the record and give Smith leave to file when jurisdiction returns to her. Smith, of course, is trying to keep Trump from running the clock. I assume he's fairly frustrated with Trump's delay game, doing everything he can to keep hold of his trial date. Here, he might have overstepped a little bit.
Tell me the consequence of that, about prosecutors overstepping. And I ask you this only in the context of such an important case, because in all of the Trump prosecutions, the judges and the prosecutors are going to be under greater scrutiny than almost any other case we've ever covered.
And prosecutors are always held to a higher standard than defense lawyers, just in terms of their conduct. So, maybe he should have held off on doing this, but I think the delay issue is a big one. Look, there are greater sins and lesser sins prosecutors can commit, and this, if it's a sin at all, would be on the very lesser end of the spectrum. I think we'll likely see the judge either say, everything's stayed, everything's frozen, don't do anything else. Or maybe she'll just say, Mr. Smith, refile your motions later on. I think it's very unlikely she'll award Trump any sort of monetary damages.
Listen, I want to talk to you about the Colorado case and Donald Trump being on the ballot. We may hear from the Supreme Court at any point now about whether they'll take on this case or what they'll do about it. There are other states in which we are now, obviously we've seen Maine. There's 17 states involved, but we've seen more action in Massachusetts and Illinois tonight. What do you make of where we stand on that particular issue, the 14th Amendment, and whether Donald Trump is qualified to run again, and how the Supreme Court will evaluate this?
It seems to me that the Supreme Court will have to hear this case. It's a little bit confusing because every state has different rules about how they determine who gets to appear on their ballot and what the standards are. For instance, in Illinois, which is in play tonight, the law in Illinois actually requires the board that does this work to make a determination about a candidate's eligibility to hold office. And that's what the 14th Amendment speaks to, Trump's eligibility to hold office, not his qualification to appear on the ballot in any particular state. But frankly, just to avoid confusion and all sorts of problems in the upcoming election, makes sense for the court to go ahead and take this and hear it. But we have not seen them show a real inclination here to act quickly, even with these pressing time deadlines that are emerging this week.
Well, we're here every day, so when they do it, we'll be ready for it. Joyce, thanks as always, my friend. Joyce Vance is the former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. We always appreciate her expertise, and that's our show for tonight. Way Too Early with Jonathan Lemire is up next.
After a full year, the Oversight Committee of the House of Representatives has discovered corruption of foreign influence peddling by a president of the United States.
It's startling. It should scare any American, and quite frankly, it shows the illegal grift that Donald Trump and his family have put on this country.
You'll see that we used very conservative accounting methods here, and the Republicans have not been able to find one thing wrong with this report. They basically accepted the facts.
House Democrats saying that Donald Trump received millions of dollars from foreign governments during his presidency, the dozens of countries he accepted payments from, and what else was uncovered in that report. Plus, Israel's defense minister has outlined a new phase in the country's war against Hamas, the targeted approach that's now on the table as the nation still tries to free hostages. And also ahead, Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley is addressing the backlash over her comments about the Iowa caucuses. We'll show you what she said and which GOP rival called her a phony.
Good luck to all of us. If there's ever been a time we needed to pray, because I guarantee you all these other countries are looking at the instability of ours and saying, wow, what a bunch of mixed up, unstable people. Good luck. Shalom.